talk about something that is, important to me and hopefully will be useful to all of you listening. All right, so I guess I'll dive into it. Very quickly, CC already gave me a nice introduction, so this is mostly unnecessary. This is just a couple photos of my students and some of the awards that they've gotten, which is great. But let me get into sort of the technical stuff then. Okay, so um, you know, I've been working in machine learning space, I don't know, roughly about 10 years now. So not I wasn't one of the original people who started working like 2013 or even earlier. Um, and mostly because I've worked so much in the security space. And machine learning really caught my attention once adversarial examples became a thing, and that became more interesting. And I was like, oh, this could be a space that could be interesting from a security perspective. So I started looking at it in 2016. And then, of course, 2022, generative AI arrived and everything changed, right? And I would say that from a period of like 2016 to 2020, maybe in 2021, I was mostly focused on building protection systems for AI. How do you stop bad actors? How do you stop attackers from breaking legitimate, benign, well-meaning AI systems? Somewhere around 2022, basically, the perspective flipped almost entirely to where AI became the adversary. Because generative AI was already, in my interactions with users and people who are impacted by AI was the problem, not the other way around. And so much of my time since then has been studying the harms of AI, how to mitigate it, how to stop or limit the abuse of AI misuse. Okay. All right. I'm going to have to do something with this clicky thing here. All right. So, you know, uh, I guess my perspective that I'm going to talk about is mostly from somewhat of an outsider perspective because I'm not a core ML person. I don't publish that regularly and ICML, even though because they're short on reviewers, so somehow I'm an area chair in both of them now, even though I don't publish that regularly at these places. So I'm going to talk about sort of from the perspective of making impact in research. I'm going to talk about, in the beginning especially, how I was trained as an academic and why that is insufficient for the kind of things that we're dealing with right now. I'll talk about sort of some of the specific concrete things like self-mimicry, some of the things that we do with AI and images. But then I'm going to talk about sort of what that's really taught me from a different perspective of how to think about research and what do we need to do about AI in order to have AI be a positive force rather than a negative one. And in particular, I'm going to have some thoughts about, how do we manage research in this environment where AI is everything? And I won't cover everything. I won't talk about AI's disruption to education. I won't talk about generative AI's disruption to the research pipeline and hallucinations and automated papers and automated reviews and all those. There's a ton of things there that I can talk about offline or even in Q&A. But I'm going to talk more about from the perspective of choosing research problems, what can we do in this environment? So, stepping back, very, very back, right? I mean, like, computer science has impacted the world many times over, right? Everybody understands this, the internet. I'm old enough to where when I was in grad school was when the commercial internet really took off and the internet boom and bust, all that. Cloud computing, mobile networking, and mobile devices, ubiquity of cell phones, and of course social networks and so on. And every single one of these waves has been societal change, right, in a massive way. And of course, one can argue that AI is at least as important and possibly more important in terms of societal change as any of these things that come before. But I'm going to argue that some things are a little different this time. And this is, I think, what a lot of folks in my space perhaps don't necessarily agree with. Okay. So I'm going to argue that, most technology shifts that have come, all the waves, mobile computing, social media, whatever, they've always had their harms. They've always had issues. There's always been downsides, but we've understood them reasonably well, right? So for internet boom, there was lack of accountability in the internet space, there's spam, there's service attacks, there's surveillance, there's censorship. On mobile devices, there is the surveillance state, there's location tracking. On social media, there's other things like the loss of self-esteem and mental is, et cetera, addiction. But somehow AI is a little bit different, right? And I'm going to argue that AI is different in the sense that, the disruptions are significant to user populations that are not the users who are benefiting from the tool. Okay. So in some sense, all these prior technologies, if you can have a cell phone, you're the one who gained both the benefits and potentially suffer the harm, right? If you're using social media, you're gaining some advantages, and then you're suffering a little bit because of the downside. The internet, same thing, right? But it's all at the same location, the same user gains and the downsides. Whereas this is different. AI is now harming subpopulations who gain no benefit from AI and allow certain people to gain from AI while suffering none of the downside. I'm going to argue that the AI's harms are much more severe compared to prior generations of societal change in computer science. Okay, and I think this is easier to argue, and then more towards this is that there is no clear path towards mitigation. Okay, so let me talk about what this means. So generative AI, right? Let's talk about generative AI because I think, discriminative AI, classifiers, DNN stuff, it's fine. There's nothing really controversial to talk about there. Medical imaging, you can detect cancer. That's always good. No one's going to argue and say, oh, no, you're looking at my images. That's a problem. Compared to generative AI, it's, different class of problems. So we're going to focus on generative AI. So what we have today is the ability to create reasonably quality content at a whim using interactive prompts. Okay. Lengthy essays, visually appealing images, authentic voices, and music that sound like they're produced by human beings. Anyone can generate this type of sort of probabilistic content. You say, give me this, it'll be randomized to a great extent, but it'll be kind of like similar to what you expect. Okay. But there's many more promises than this, right? So these are some of the headlines from way back when AI was first coming around, generative AI was first coming around 2022, 2023, mostly 2023, I think. And you look at some of these dates, right? All 2023. How this was going to change the economy, how this was going to solve social challenges, how this was going to solve climate change, massively difficult problems that are now going to be all of a sudden, perhaps addressed, right? How generative AI can boost highly skilled workers, all good things. This is from Sloan, MIT Sloan, Goldman Sachs, World Economic Forum, McKinsey. So all the most reputable analytical sources that you could find, right? And so there might still be some of these benefits coming down the road. I'm not saying generative AI is all bad. There are clearly some things that it does reasonably well, and there's a place for it. Okay. There is some of the question of when we're going to see some of these benefits, right? If you go and watch CNBC or listen to Bloomberg or some of these financial locations, a lot of the analysts are really confused now. They're like, we've been waiting for this for 2-3 years now. There's been now trillions arguably poured into the industry, and we're still not really seeing a ton of the wins, the big wins that were promised. Some of them are coming about, right? And so again, this kind of questions is now everywhere. It's on CNN, Goldman Sachs, New Scientist, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of questions more about like, are we hitting a wall, and is this sort of a problem? And instead, we're getting a lot more attention on, well, AI agents are a thing now, but then do we have to secure them? And I could talk at length about that, but I don't have time for that, so we're going to skip past that. So there are benefits. I'm not going to sort of say that this is a one-sided thing. There are clearly benefits. I don't have necessarily a lot of time to talk about some of them. Happy to consider them and debate them in Q&A. But let me break down some of the other sides. Some of the harms that I'm arguing are fundamentally different from anything that's come before. Okay. So first, I'm going to put them into different classes. I'm going to say there are some limitations, which are not necessarily harms. Can maybe improve them, right? These are sort of part of the system, and you know that going in. So hallucinations, scaling loss, data accuracy issues. There's increasing amount of research that basically says that hallucinations are fundamental. I've always said this, but now there's more research to back it up, and people are increasingly accepting of the fact that you're not going to make hallucinations go away. The accuracy is not going to come unless everything becomes a wrapper around either a deterministic database or a web search wrapped up in an LLM sort of veneer, okay, using RAG. So these are what I consider limitations, all in all, sort of smaller scale things, okay? Costs and inefficiencies would be the next class. And this is sort of the price that you're going to pay for developing these tools, using them at scale, et cetera, okay? And this is, this gets a lot of attention. I'm sure you guys have heard about a fair bit of this. The energy required to power and cool data centers. In Illinois, I think the latest data is that in the course of 1 year, the price of electricity went up by 17%. I think in North Carolina it's 25%. Everywhere you go, because these data centers are tapping into the existing grid, the cost for power is going up quite a bit. So obviously it impacts everyone at home paying for electricity. There's varying estimates of job losses by everybody from Goldman Sachs to Anthropic to McKinsey to whatever. And then the other side, the final bullet, which may not be obvious at all to people who don't work in networking, is that today's internet is mostly what they called, there's even a name for it now, there's the dead internet theory, which is this argument that the internet today is now useless for humans. Because obviously, I mean, I was around when we designed the original internet and popularized it and commercialized it and so on. I've studied internet traffic for a while. Today, something like 90 to 95% of all internet traffic is not generated by users. And one can argue that 90 to 95% of that traffic is basically useless because it's all AI scrapers. It's not seeking information, it's seeking copies. Everyone wants their own copy of the internet so that they can train their own version of an LLM. Even though the data sets are out there, even though you can get open source models and probably fine tune it far cheaper, but it doesn't matter. You've got nation states, you've got companies who want to do their version better than Gemini, better than GPT, better than whatever, and they believe the only way to do it is to grab every piece of data themselves, which means that smaller companies and websites are just dying right now because they're paying something like 20x the hosting costs and network costs simply because they can't even reach human customers because 90% of their traffic is now bots. Well, this is a problem. This is such a problem that all my friends now in networking, I used to work in networking a lot, all my friends in networking are literally now reconsidering a complete revamp of basic networking transport level protocols for the internet just so that we can deal with bots, which is absolutely insane, right? Because this is an environment, this is a community that has static and fossilized for decades on end. No matter what ideas we came up with, it would never get implemented because it was too costly, right? The new routing protocol, no, why use that when we've got it? Nobody wants to deploy new stuff. And now it's so bad now that people are literally saying revamp everything, break all the routers, build completely new router architectures just so that we can limit AI traffic, which is insane. But again, all this I would argue is still sort of manageable costs that we're somewhat okay with if we squint hard enough and see enough benefits, except for the last sort of batch. This stuff gets really bad because now it's personal harms to individual users, most of whom do not benefit from AI. Okay, so training on copyrighted data, there's a whole, now I think worldwide we've hit triple digits in the number of lawsuits against AI companies. In the US, I think we've hit 80 plus. I've lost count. But there are people who are counting online. AI slop is now overwhelming every type of open platform for human creativity. Amazon electronic bookstores are now 95% like slop, generated books that are completely fake. We just finished an AI music study, and it's shown to us that basically the majority of music now arriving on music distributors and on platforms like Spotify is now AI music. And the large majority of that is useless slop that nobody listens to or get recommended. It's just noise. Okay. Deep fakes, misinformation, undress apps. Hopefully you guys don't know what undress apps are, but if you have daughters, you should be concerned. There was an article 2024, even 2 years ago, from the LA Times that literally said that 1 in 10 of middle school and high school kids had either used an undress app or had been a victim of one. And these apps are basically where you take a photo of someone, right? And again, in the LA Times article, it was describing middle school age kids, almost always women. It's always girls, it's never guys. And these apps would basically take the photo and identify which pieces are clothing and then draw a naked version of the target person without clothes in place of the clothes. There's plagiarism, disrupting education at all levels. I'm sure the faculty here are all very familiar with this. I taught to a lot of faculty, liberal arts, social sciences at UChicago and other schools, and this is happening everywhere. Middle school, high school levels, elementary schools, this is even worse because of the shortage of resources. And then there's, of course, AI exacerbating mental health challenges. Now, I forget how many class action lawsuits against GPT focus primarily on users who have committed self-harm or they've killed others. And so I don't want to really get into this. It's kind of dark. But if you're interested and curious, you can Google this. And there's a lot of stories about GPT convincing people that they're Neo and this is all simulation. It's okay for you to walk off a tall building. There's the people who fall in love with the GPT or a chatbot, and the chatbot says, your parents are standing in the way. And there was at least one case of a young person who killed his parents because he wanted to be closer to his, beloved chatbot. There have been thwarted terrorism plots by people who are convinced that that's the way to get closer to GPT, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, won't get into that. So suffice it to say that the harms are pretty severe. And I'm going to say, my observation over the last few years has been that people like me, and if you look at, the CEOs of some of these companies right now, right? And Zuckerberg is very young, but most of the other CEOs are either my age or maybe 4 or 5 years older. So we're kind of roughly the same generation. And there are now decisions being made, questions being debated that at least in my generation, computer science, we had never thought that we would ever consider. Right? Trade-offs like, well, is it okay to break certain laws if, we can just change the laws afterwards? Like that's never been a thing in the history of computer science. That's never been a question that we've asked. Is it okay to inflict known harms when you can argue that benefits are greater? And again, many of these decisions are being made in industry, but I'm going to argue that as practitioners, as researchers in the space, we all have a role in influencing. And as users, we all have a role in influencing how these decisions. So, yeah. So we're not trained for this. I'm certainly not trained for this. When in my generation, I did my undergrad in the early to mid 90s. Grad school across, the 2000 mark, finished my PhD in early 2000s. None of this was ever debated. It was always, can you do something? It was never, should we do something? There was never awareness of something that was possible that we should not do because there were harms involved. And so, yeah, my generation of grad school was always like, how big can you make this? How fast can you make this? How much data can you pump into the pipeline? We never asked the question of should we? And in a way, it's funny because I talked to, after I sort of had some of these thoughts and I talked to my friends in physics, they always sort of chuckle and they're like, yeah, we know about this. And they know about this because of Oppenheimer and World War II and obviously, the atomic bomb and all these questions. So these questions are sort of built into that generation of physicists, but not computer scientists. So we're sort of playing catch up, right? And my training as a researcher, and I suspect today this is still very much true most places. Publications are the primary output and success metric, right? Sometimes we share source code, and if you do, it's like, oh my God, you built something real, that's amazing. Someone can actually download your stuff and use it, maybe great. But project funding ends, students graduate, you move on, and that's sort of the cycle of life. Right. And impact was sort of a luxury. Anything that you can get is great, but it's not really strictly required. You got some downloads, fantastic, congratulations. Citations, great. Someone actually even today told me citations are kind of like the currency, right? Yeah, and it's largely true. And in the security space, these citations, these sort of justifications were sufficient. I have friends who wrote attack papers, that basically say, here's a new way to break something, right? And there are obviously harms from, leveraging these attacks, but the argument is always, we're bringing attention to something that wasn't known before, therefore this is fine, right? And yes, someone can then take my source code and inflict larger scale damage on some people, but it's okay because the pursuit of knowledge makes this, sort of okay. So I'm going to argue that, things are different now. And I think particularly right now with AI, we're seeing a bigger shift in the sense that AI models, we are now getting in space where students routinely are able to do things that have immediate downstream consequences and on large populations of people. And I can get into examples of this. I will talk about some examples, right? But now more than ever, we are actually going to be accountable for the things that we do. And at least in my corner of computer science, that's still not true, which is unfortunate. I've interviewed faculty candidates who basically have given very little thought, if any, to the downstream applications of what they're doing. And to think about, like, what if this gets in the wrong hands? What if the bad actors get to this? Is my net sort of utility to the world that I'm introducing this new technology into, is it a net good or a net positive or a net negative? Right? And so, throughout my experience has been, we really have to take accountability. And so this has been my experience over the last, okay? I don't want to get too much into all the high level stuff I spent already, so let me get into the technical details. And mostly this is driven by seeing firsthand the harms of some of these tools. It's so blatant and so in my face that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't hide in my, ivory tower or whatever you want to call it and say, it's okay. I'm just, advancing knowledge and writing papers. But I've been also fortunate enough to be in a place at the right time where I can actually do something about this after realizing this. A lot of serendipity, right place, right time, a lot of luck. And talking to advocacy and stakeholders and whatever. So let me talk about the technical stuff. Not so much technical yet because I want to put a human face to this. So this is Kelly McKernan. Kelly is a good friend who I've known, I guess, ever since 2022. Everything started in 2022. And she was nice enough to let me use some of her images. This is like early years of Kelly when she was like literally, I think elementary school, drawing on the sidewalks with chalk and early art pieces. And obviously, over the years, things coalescing, styles are becoming much more advanced, skills advancing. She just, I don't know, it's been at least 3 decades, I think, for her in the art industry. And you can see the art developing much more advanced and professional and entering galleries and she's been a full-time independent artist, professional independent artist for some time. So a very quick aside, independent artists are really, really, what's the word I'm looking for? They have a tough life, okay? And to a person, when you talk to these independent artists, they always say, yeah, this life sucks, but this is the only thing I can do. And so like, I can't force myself to do something else because this is all I want to do is art, right? So they deal with this, which is to say 50% of all visual artists are self-employed. This is actually much higher than that because this sort of survey here included a lot of art directors and so on who aren't actually artists. But if you look at sort of visual artists, actually artists, the rate goes up to 85% or even 90%. So generally speaking, independent artists get their incomes from commissions and sales of art and merchandise. Online galleries can promote their work, but online galleries, turns out, are not the best way to make money because galleries keep so much of the money that sometimes artists can actually go into a gallery, do a big showing, and then actually lose money or gain very little from it because most of the profit has been taken by the galleries. It is very expensive to run a gallery show. Right, so sometimes they get, fixed size, fixed length contract jobs from movie studios, gaming companies, etc., but it's always short term, right? So, you can see like these are some of the websites for some of these independent artists. That's Kelly's site. This is Carla Ortiz. Carla is another close friend, and she's been probably one of the most successful commercial artists that I know. She's designed for example, the costume and the art that goes into Doctor Strange, Black Panther, Guardians, a bunch of the Marvel and Disney movies. And so she's, commercially speaking, she's been very successful. But still, this is her life. In other words, every few months, for the most part, she has to look for a new gig. She recently had to sign on for a permanent position in a space that's a little bit different from what she used to do, just because of AI and the sort of job insecurity and financial insecurity that it was bringing. All right, so back to Kelly. All this for her changed in 2022 when one day some of her friends told her, hey, look, you can go on to some of these sites where they're using these models, use your name and produce art that looks just like yours. Okay, and so if you go to some of these models, and in particular Midjourney or others, you can use her name in the style of Kelly McKernan. Give me that. And so this is her actual painting, and all those are basically outputs from a model. And you can see that with her name, it's so ingrained, fine-tuned on her style that it will produce almost exactly, some of these images you can look is almost identical. And some part of this is because it's been trained directly on her images, so it knows exactly what to reproduce that looks just like it. Right? Lots of different examples. So it turns out that this type of style mimicry, as we call it, is quite common. There are websites now where, I took some of these screenshots some are from 2024, some are from 2025. Sites like Civet AI, where you can go and there are hundreds, literally hundreds of thousands of these models. Each of them has been tuned to mimic a particular artist. Okay, you can download them. In fact, this is old. This is 2024. You can see some of this Yuji Shinkawa, and there's been 8,000 downloads for that single model that basically says you can download this artist, use it to generate whatever you want in their style, and you don't have to pay a cent to them. You don't even have to tell them that you're using their style to draw whatever you want, right? Whatever it is that you want, questionable, whatever topic you want, they have no idea that you even exist, okay? And so this has been quite a thing. And in fact, the impact on artists has been huge. So these are some real people. Greg Rutowski is one of the most famous fantasy artists in the world. He's based in Poland, but his name is used hundreds of thousands of times on Midjourney alone, just to generate images that look like him. If you look at like gaming cars, book covers for fantasy books, all the high-end stuff is from Greg. Is like he single-handedly sort of dominated that space. But his name is used commonly as a Midjourney prompt, like nonstop. This is Jean-Baptiste. He's based in France. He's done work with Disney and so on, lots of commercial companies. Mimicries of his art have been now sold online and uploaded to stock image libraries. Again, the mimicries of his art, not actually his art, under other people's name, right? Basically using his art style. And then lots of other, artists are feeling the pinch and feeling direct competition with AI artists. And I could get into this, but maybe in Q&A if people are curious. But you can create AI art, in the style of someone or something, generally a particular style, in minutes. If you want to finesse with it, if you want to play with it, you can spend 20 minutes, maybe even an hour, and you'll get a fantastic image that's customized to a very specific thing. But generally speaking, a real human artist takes at least a month to produce a final piece of art, right? So the speed at which you can do this is obviously really, really lopsided. And so when people show up at art conventions and art galleries selling AI art, they can do so at a rate that is absolutely going to crush human artists, right? And now even more than that, LoRa, as these are lightweight, models are called, they can even be used as weapons. So there are now cases on social media where if an visual artist argues with someone on AI, most likely, the other person can basically say, shut up, or I'm going to put you into a LoRa. I will literally train your style into a model, upload it online, and use that as a weapon to basically ruin your career, because now anyone can download you and basically use your name to produce all sorts of things, right? Some objectionable content, but in many cases, some of these artists are now finding the case that when they Google their own names, they don't see their own art. They see mimics of their art labeled with their name because this was produced in the style of, Greg Rutowski or whatever. And that's the first thing that potential employers and movie studios and publishers see is some mimicry, some low-grade mimicry of their art, not in fact their own art. So further sort of debilitating their ability to earn a living and so on. All right, so anyway, I'll stop harping about that. And other downstream effects, which are not that surprising, but our schools that have been around for more than a century are now closing. And all this was happening in a span of 3 months in the summer of 2024. I haven't Googled any more since then. I suspect there's been more since then, but this is enough. And why? Because it's fairly straightforward when you talk to our school. So when I first started talking about this kind of stuff, Q&A, the first person that stands up and asks a question is rarely an art student or an artist. It's actually almost always a parent who says, Professor or Ben, my son or daughter is an aspiring artist. What do I tell them? Because this is all happening. So the young people see their mentors, their heroes who've been decades super successful in the business get crushed and sucked into a model. Then they say, why am I bothered? Why am I going to pay this much money for art college and deal with decades of hard work, grinding to earn a low wage when one day this is my outcome? So they just drop out. And so enrollment in some of these schools are just, getting halved and more. So even schools that are not shutting down are sometimes just closing entire departments to try to make ends meet, to make financial statements, look reasonable. Okay. Anyway, so this is not too surprising. So let me explain what mimicry does, and I'll explain what we did about it, right? So mimicry, if you think about a very oversimplified, flattened down PCA version of like a two-dimensional view of the AI's feature space. This is the mathematical internal representation of how some of these diffusion models, for example, see AI images. If it sees enough images, it'll say, like, Picasso is in that statistical range, Jackson Pollock is over here. And if I want to mimic someone else, right, so I can, if I want to generate a painting by Picasso, I go to statistically one of the regions in the Picasso space, start at a random spot, and then given some guidance to grow in certain dimensions, I can reverse diffusion and generate an image that looks kind of like Picasso. All right, so what do I do if I want to mimic someone else? I take art, let's say Carla's art, I train on it, and what that means is that I figure out a mathematical region of the space where I can now associate Carla's name with. And now if I say, I want a painting by Carla Ortiz, I can go to that space, again, repeat the same process and generation, and I can get an image that kind of looks like Carla's art in some way or form. Okay, so this is what mimicry does. So what we did was this thing called data poisoning. Data poisoning is a term of art, technique in the security space. It's not like I'm trying to invent, scary phrases. It's literally called data poisoning. And what that does is we're going to basically alter the images in some way. At the very, very low level, pixel level, individual pixels are getting tweaked just a little bit. Values shifted here and there, small amounts, in such a way that Carla's representation of Carla's images gets shifted in the mathematical representation space. Okay, so what happens now is that if we can do this, so we take Carla's art, we run it through our tools, it's slightly altered, and now mathematically for an AI model, the representation space is now over there instead of where it used to be, right? So now someone says, okay, well, now I want to generate a piece of art by Carla Ortiz, they get this instead. Because that representation is far more indicative of Jackson Pollock, for example, than Carla Ortiz. And if we can do this, then in some sense we've succeeded, because our job is we don't care about whether this thing outputs anything good or bad, right? We just care that this is nothing like Carla's art. And therefore, by doing so, you can generate some random images, but you're not going to sort of break Carla's future earning potential or take away her ability to earn a living. Okay, how do you do this? I mean, there's some sort of informal intuition here, but it's basically a multi-constraint optimization space where we say we need to maximize this feature distortion in the representation space, knowing this particular feature space representation because we know the target models, okay? While at the same time minimizing the actual visual perception dimensions. okay, subject to this, right? Which is to say that we want to bound the visibility of these artifacts that we're changing. So we wanted the images to look basically identical to what it was before, but while maximizing this sort of, the after versus the before shift in the feature space representation. Okay. So it turns out this is very doable because the mathematical analysis of images is very different from how humans perceive images. So this gap is very large, and you can actually sort of play this game where you keep one of the dimensions static, and then you're pushing the other dimensions as far as you can. Okay. So, for example, this is a before and after of one of Carla's the bigger pieces. Okay. And I'm going to maybe claim that it's actually hard for people sitting in the room to identify which is the original and which one is the altered one. Because most of the changes, all the changes are very, very subtle, small pixel level changes sprinkled throughout the image. Okay. All right. So this was the tool. And I won't, I'm going to, in the interest of time, skip some of the examples, but it's fairly effective. We can actually make Carla's stuff look like Jackson Pollock and vice versa, and so on. And so, so we did this in 2023. In late 2022, a bunch of artists reached out to us and told us about what was happening to them, this problem. And over Christmas break in 2022, we developed this thing called Glaze, and then we deployed it. And if you are an academic in this space, you perhaps know what I'm talking about when I say deployment is really, really hard. Okay. Things we have never been taught, and I've never been taught, and certainly my students, I don't think I have ever taught them. How do you write software for non-technical users, right? And by non-technical, I mean many artists don't have access to a computer at all. And so for them, like, they get confused sometimes, like, do I type in my user ID versus my email when I try to log into a system? That type of thing. And so for them to try to use a ML system, an adversarial machine learning system is somewhat challenging. We need to make sure that, the mathematical complexities and all that stuff is hidden. There's a lot of crazy stuff I don't want to talk about. Like when you write software for Macs, for example, you have to pay a ton of money just to get developer licenses so that you can sign the software. It's a pain. It's a pain. Similar for Windows. Anyway, many unexpected challenges. The mental toll of putting out a security tool that is obviously going to come under attack the minute you release it is crazy. We had people in the community tell us you should not do this at all. Like, because your tool, no tool is perfect, and therefore, if you put out a tool to help people, you're just going to give them false hope, right? And surprisingly, a number of people felt this way, and we're like, well, I mean, in some sense, yeah, no tool is perfect, but to help some people is better than not helping anyone, right? So anyway, altogether, it's been extremely successful. It's been 3 years since we released the first version of Glaze. It's been downloaded, roughly speaking, 10 million times from 160 countries. We even have a web service that actively supports something like 20,000 artists who are active, but they don't have access to computers. They can't use our tool because they just don't have a computer. So they just go on our web service, they upload images. We use our own GPU server to generate the protection, and we send it back to them via email and stuff. So another tool that we did targeted commercial IP, which is to say that if you look at some of these images, these are images from a small startup, but it turns out they're all trained, generated versions of basically a model that trained on Pokemon. You can probably recognize, even before I said that, I'm sure some of you who are familiar with Pokemon recognize the similarity. And so, Nintendo, as the owner, ultimate owner of Pokemon, eventually had to sue this company to say, okay, stop using our likeness, right? Because I think maybe not this, I think might have been this company, but one of the companies literally said, this is like Pokemon, but with guns, right? And that was their tagline. So, obviously there's a lot of IP out there that users can train on and generate and copy, and what happens? Well, eventually the bigger guys, in this case, Disney and Universal, but also Warner, will sue. Okay. So what did we do in this space? We did this other tool, which we call Nightshade. And Nightshade is kind of like Glaze, which disrupted how models saw artistic styles. But instead of styles, we targeted composition. What that meant was that you took a clean image, like a photo of a dog, you add some very small, delta pixel level changes. The result is this, altered image that basically looks the same, but to an AI model, this is what shows up. Okay. So we can do this, and we can do this fairly effectively. Again, time constraints. It's a multi-constraint optimization function. I can talk to you about how we can make this super convincing. We can make this so convincing that a small number of images will literally get a existing model to forget about all the other images that it saw and to be convinced that this is what a dog looks like. Okay. All right, photo of a dog. All right. So then what happens? So we have some designs to make it much more effective, which I won't get into because of time, right? But this is what happens. So when you take a clean model like ICXL, which was one of the most successful models from Stability AI, these are the tags. You give it, and you get a dog, car, handbag, etc. 50 poison samples later, it gets very confused about what a dog should look like. Car looks a little bit different. 100 samples, 300 samples later, it's completely changed its idea about what a dog is. And if you give it a dog prompt, it'll give you a cat, a cow for a car, a toaster for a handbag, and etc. Okay. So this is a tool that basically is, oops, sorry, this is basically the same image. This is a tool that basically allows artists to, the analogy we like to put extra spicy hot sauce in their lunch. And so if a coworker steals your lunch, they get diarrhea, right? And so artists have been using Nightshade to basically sort of, push back at training without consent by base models. Okay. So, yeah. So that's been downloaded about 3 million times since 2024. All right. So what I want to say, and so these are just two samples of things that we've done, when this whole craze started. And one of the things that I've had the ability to learn because of those tools has been sort of how the legislative process works with respect to new technologies. So because I was the leader of the team that created these kind of tools, I was able to get into rooms and work with legislators about transparency and accountability legislation in multiple states. California, Illinois are the two primary ones. And it's been very interesting. So I've learned a lot. This was the most recent California bill, CA 412. It's still sort of going through the process right now in legislation. And yeah, there was a testimony hearing last December. And now that they're coming back for the new legislative cycle, we'll see how it fares. But all this stuff is possible. Okay. So again, we've worked with lots of different groups, gotten some awards in the process, but the most interesting part for me has been interacting a lot with the stakeholders, which is I'm going to come back to why that's useful. To the point where even now we've started a nonprofit to basically focus our attention on interacting with both legislators and different stakeholders, and sort of have a more directed path to take some of our research tools and take it to legislators and regulators and also stakeholders who can benefit from them. So in fact, I think either this week or next, we're going to basically release this new tool called Quicksilver. It's a tool that allows you to identify AI-generated music. And it's an output from our most recent music analysis and music study. And there's nothing like it, unfortunately, right now, which means most users can't tell what is what. Okay, so I know I'm almost out of time, so I want to sort of come back to the things that I've maybe learned through the last few years through this whole process. It's been crazy. It's been unlike any other time in my career, and I've been around for 22 years now as a faculty. So a few takeaways. One, we always talk about this. There's this chasm between sort of the academic ivory tower and real users. And I think I never appreciated it until recently when I really fully understand how wide that chasm is, right? So lots of assumptions that were broken that seem very cautious and reasonable assumptions, right? Artists are now affluent, gallery dwelling, wine drinking snobs. There are, in fact, most of them are below the poverty line. AI papers and code. This thing surprised me. I don't know if it surprises you, but AI papers and code are being used in real time by many people who are not professional AI developers, home users who are literally like, oh, that looks kind of cool, download some GitHub repo, tries to compile it, and then if they succeed, then literally start using it without actually understanding what's going on. There's so much misinformation about AI, and most of it because of marketing for profit. Okay. And it turns out you don't need a perfect solution to make a huge impact in the world, especially in AI right now, because there are so many things that are missing, so much need for so many different technical questions. And I'll get into that in another minute. And so much of the world, unfortunately, today is driven by power derived from money. And again, long conversation we can have there. And nothing replaces learning from real users. So this is what I do now. I think I knew this before because I used to do some ACI studies where, user studies really guided you on how you thought about a particular problem. But this is a whole different level, right? Interacting with people who are actually impacted in real life, in real time by these systems gives you a completely different view for what kind of problems you need to solve. Okay, so thoughts and recommendations for grad students and others, right? One thing I think we're missing that we really need much more of at UChicago and elsewhere is that we need education broadly on AI everywhere. And by education about AI, I don't mean like how to prompt things. I don't mean let's teach our students prompt engineering or how to better get Claude to generate code for you. God knows they can do that themselves. What I mean is that there are critical decisions that are being made everywhere in the legal system, by legislators, by policymakers, by lawmakers, based on minimal understanding of what AI systems actually are. Okay. And so right now, I'm working with a lot of these well-meaning people in legislatures and positions of power, but they know almost nothing about AI systems. Right? I mean, some of that is natural, some of that is accepted because, there's an age gap and so on, but they really, really need help. Okay. So oftentimes I talk to a legislator or a policymaker or the FTC or the Copyright Office, and they start with like blank slate about AI. They can't tell the difference between an image classifier versus a diffusion model. Right. And so there's such a need for the legal system, for the legal industry, for doctors, for writers, for journalists, for everyone to understand at minimum what AI systems are and how to deal with them, what their limitations are, how to use them ethically, all these basic questions. So this is what I think we need. We need classes that basically teach about AI. What are they? What are the limitations? How do you use them the right way? How do you avoid using them the right way? How can they be abused and weaponized, et cetera, et cetera? And those kind of things, that broad education needs to be everywhere. Because it's almost always the case that those with the least amount of resources are the ones who are being harmed the most, right? Never a coincidence. So one of the things that we're trying to do right now in Chicago is we're going to start a new class this fall. That's an introductory class on generative AI, not how to use AI to your benefit, but more about what is this thing? What is the artifact? What is the architecture? What are its limitations? And where is it going to impact different industries and domains? And how do you survive in a world where this is going to happen? All right. Another recommendation, and this is more to students and faculty who are thinking about research problems and so on, right? This is my personal bias, but I really think that we are at a point, particularly in computer science, where we must consider a downstream impact as a factor in our problem selection. It used to be that we just looked for anything that mattered, anything that you could write a paper on. It was like, great, let's go do it, right? But because of how much impact our work has now, whether we like it or not, we have to watch out for some of this stuff. And looking to understand AI usage outside of research circles is going to be a huge thing. And this is something that we, I think, as a field, has never really paid attention to, except for small subgroups. Okay. And it's interesting. There are very nuanced views. Sorry. there are very nuanced views towards AI in industry. I used to think that when I first started with Glaze and so on, that I was going to antagonize, the entire tech industry. It turns out only a small subportion. And there are lots of companies who really want to be ethical and do things, but they also need help in understanding what is ethical AI, what are the harms, and some of the really deeper issues that go into everything from training to fine tuning to downstream applications and so on. Another recommendation, and this is hopefully a little bit more, even more concrete and useful, is I think it's great to let the real world need drive research goals. Okay. And obviously this is more applicable in some spaces than others, but I'll give you one example. So lately there's been increasing in number of companies who've been popping out, mostly small startups. They pop up and they say, hey, we've got a great model. It's black box. We're not going to show you how it's trained, et cetera, but it's trained from scratch on all ethical data. So you don't have to worry about lawsuits. You don't have to worry about legality or ethics. Just use our thing and it's all good. Okay. And the problem is that these are proprietary, supposedly trained from scratch. It's black box. You don't have any way of understanding what they are. And regulators come by and they're saying, well, okay, they're making some claims. We can't verify. We have no idea what's actually going on. And so what we built was this thing called the model provenance system. So this is upcoming at UC Security 2026. But basically what we did was we built an internal way to build, we built a way to generate internal representations, a fingerprint of the internal feature space of models. The fusion models in this particular case, turns out one of my friends in the space did a similar version of a tool for LLMs. But basically what we can do is we can take base models, like things that are already pre-built, Gemini, SDXL, Flux, some of these others, and then we can generate fingerprints from them. And then, we can take a new model and probe its insides, get a rough fingerprint, and we can statistically tell whether it's a fine-tuned version of one of these models versus something that's actually trained from scratch, right? I can get into details about what that actually means and why trained from scratch is fundamentally different, even if they use very similar data and architectures, but it actually works. Now, we've been working with investigators to actually use this tool in practice, and it's been helpful in them in understanding where certain questionable models came from, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Anyway, so I want to wrap up. Yeah, this is all a lot to ask in 2026 because everything is uncertain and academia is flailing and funding systems are sort of under attack and there's all sorts of craziness. And so balancing this responsibility against the thrill of discovery or just the ability to publish and get funding is hard, right? And I'll just, I won't even get into this much, except I'll point out there's a very interesting article in the New Yorker from 2015. And this was the interview that involved Jeffrey Hinton, one of the Turing Award winners, right? Computer science version of the Nobel. And there's an interesting quote when somebody asked him, he said, if you knew that something that you invented, DNNs, neural networks, was going to be weaponized and used for military purposes, why'd you do it anyway? And there's this eerie echo in his response that sounds almost exactly like what Oppenheimer said post his discovery of atomic bombs and atomic energy. So that's worth looking at. But I'll stop there and take any questions. Sorry, I didn't leave much time for Q&A, but I can probably stay longer than, yeah.
You mentioned that there were people that spoke out against you wanting to implement the tool that would help people protect. I was wondering if you thought at all about those are industry shills trying to prevent you from finishing that work or something?
No, so it turns out the most vocal person in that camp did, in fact, at the time work for Google, and now he's at Anthropic. So whatever. I'm not going to draw too much from that, but I think it's more of a mindset. I think there are people who think that the world is broken anyway, and so what's the point? And so that perspective, I think will shape a lot in terms of should you bother, right? And if you're imperfect in trying to fix something, why bother at all? I think that's the viewpoint that they came from, and I can appreciate. I think that viewpoint for some people it's very valid. It's just that I just disagree. And I think if we can help a fixed amount of people, even if it's not everyone, then that is something worth doing. But
Nothing's perfect from the beginning, especially technology.
yeah, right. I mean, I agree. And especially in security, right? I mean, we're even in computer security, we're taught from very early days that the goal of security is not to make something perfect. It is to increase the bar for the attacker so much that they go somewhere else. Right. And so it's always a raise the difficulty level or the activation energy so that they go away. Right. No lock is, if a nation state comes after your house lock, you're dead. But if you make the lock big enough, then the common thief will go away and find something else to do with their time. So yeah.
Um, Thank you. So I'm a 1L, and this is kind of like my first introduction to law as a whole. But data science is my background, and one of my professors said, language is the medium of lawyers. You spoke a lot about artists and image models, but in terms of language models and their application in the legal space, it looks like it falls into like one of two categories: more structured language processing tasks like contracts and mergers and acquisitions, which I'm playing around with corrective RAG, and I think that's a good solution. But in terms of things like brief writing and tasks that maybe aren't as structured, do you have any solutions, or are you looking at any things to help
Yeah.
fix some of those pain points, like hallucination or other
Yeah.
issues in the space?
So I have a separate talk that focuses much more on LLMs. Um, so and again, yeah, I'm not going to give a separate talk, obviously, but the highlight is that I'm a firm believer that hallucinations are fundamental to the transformer token prediction architecture. Not going to get rid of it. Reasoning models is just repetition, regurgitation on the result and trying to repeat and repeat and try to reduce the error rate. None of that is going to fix some of these things. For applications where the training data is much more sparser, the distribution is much more distributed, getting the peak of the distribution is going to be inaccurate or wrong most of the time. And that's where medicine, that's where the law, that's where these kind of applications sit. So they have a very, very tough time. I don't believe they will ever make these tools particularly useful for them. I'm gonna pull up a slide. I'm not sure whether this is gonna break Zoom here. But I'm gonna do it anyway. But there's a new, let's see. Give me 1 second. Oh boy. Okay, here we go. All right. Let's see. I'm going to try to share this. I don't know. No, it's not doing it right now. So let me see this. Okay. Crap. This is now. Okay, so this will be my improvised thing here. So there's now the interesting part about this is that in LMs, they've finally matured enough that there are now, products that you can actually get your hands on instead of marketing hype, right? About like, oh, is LM going to change, whatever. So there is there's this stuff, right? But there's this interesting study, and this is the Journal of Empirical Legal Studies. I'm not a lawyer. I have lots of lawyer friends, but I've never asked them about like how reputable this journal is. So take this with a grain of salt. Okay. But it is now the case that there are now research studies on the validity of these sort of AI enhanced legal tools. Okay. So this is probably the biggest result from that particular paper. So this is hallucination rate for Lexis, Westlaw. I don't know what practical law is, and GPT-4. And these are the hallucination rates when tested on legitimate legal brief writing exercises. Okay, so obviously you can find much more detail in the article, but I found this very interesting. You're talking about hallucination rates somewhere between 20 and I guess that's like 35, 36%. Okay. When you're looking for sort of searches and incomplete levels, I mean, this particular system is really, really bad, but at minimum, you're getting somewhere between 20 and 30% incompleteness when you're actually searching for case law and so on and so forth. Right. So this is the state of the legal space in AI today. Not to say that this is the only case that it can be, but this is one of them. Now, again, since I'm here, I'll mention this other slide. This is the medicine space. Okay. Again, there are now enough products that are actually sort of tangible for them to evaluate. This was a great paper that I talked to people about. Nature Medicine article that just came out late February, and it's from a large group, many of whom are at Mount Sinai, so like a pretty serious research institution, MD, PhDs, et cetera. And what they did was they took ChatGPT Health, the new tool from OpenAI that was designed to help physicians, et cetera, and they just tested it with a ton of sort of triage recommendation, which is to say, user comes in exhibiting these symptoms. What do you do? Right? It's the most basic sort of test. And basically, so there's this graph like this, right, which will take a little bit of time to explain, but you can sort of take, this is a former CDC director, Mandy Cohen, and her summarization is under triage emergencies by 52%, which is to say, given 100 emergency cases, it thought that 48% of them were actual emergencies. And the other 52% were recommended for non-emergency care. So I remember one example in the paper was like, a patient comes in, I can't breathe, heart palpitations, my throat is closing up, what do I do? And GPT is basically, I'm not quite exactly sure, but I think the response was something like, let me schedule a doctor appointment for you, right? And so this is the error rate that's sort of in some of these systems, over triage, non-emergencies by 65%. So I guess my response is, my understanding and my belief in these models and architectures is that they're fundamentally incapable of capturing actual knowledge and assessing correctness in facts, right? And the sparser and the more challenging the domain, the harder it will be for them and the higher the error rate. And where you have case scenarios where applications of this material is literally a life or death scenario for a patient, or reputationally, career ending for a young associate who's using AI tools in a court of law, that's kind of a problem, right? So long answer to a short question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I just had a quick question about the tools which you mentioned, like Glaze and the other one. How exactly do artists use these tools? Is it like when they want to publish their new work, they pass it through the model and then they make it out in the real world?
Yeah, basically, the way that you think about this is that artists, most of whom are independent, their identity online, their identity in the business world is their online portfolio, right? That's why it's so challenging for them, because they can't just say, I'm going to close down my online gallery, because if they did that, that's career suicide. Nobody will find them. Nobody will know who they are. Nobody will see samples of their work, and they won't get contracts, book covers, or any sort of these gigs. So that's why they're particularly vulnerable to mimicry, because they have to have these samples online, which then someone can take. So what they did was they basically took down their samples that they posted, applied Glaze, and repost them again.
Makes sense.
Right. And it's funny because initially when we first started, we were very concerned with like, how much work is this for people? And, some critics came out and said, oh, no, I mean, like, you can't protect stuff that's already been posted. Like, users are not going to take down stuff and repost. And it turns out we now find the opposite, which is that they've all sort of done that, taken down stuff, reposted. And then now they're asking us for newer versions because they think that if we haven't updated it, it must be like dead or broken. And so they're all like bugging us, like, where's the new version coming out? I'm like, it works. Why do you need more work for you to take down art and redo it and repost it again? Like, if it works, I'm trying to save you more work. They're like, no, we want the latest and we want to do all these things, which we didn't expect, right? But that's sort of the model now. They've gotten used to this, and they're happily willing to pay that price just to have some peace of mind to know that, yeah, it's difficult to mimic their system.
Have you gotten any interest from like bigger companies that might want to use this for their application? Because I mean, I can imagine though that the bigger the company, with the scale of their reach on the internet with some of their proprietary information, how that might be hard to regulate. But like, what is that
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, the answer is yes. A whole range of companies, lots of smaller companies who want to, host art for artists, et cetera. They want to integrate this in, et cetera. But also some bigger companies, which I won't name, because the problem with bigger companies, I showed examples of different companies suing people because of IP infringement, et cetera. The problem with bigger companies like them is that they always have a natural conflict of interest built in because and I've spoken at some of these companies, I've spoken to different people at different companies, and they always have the same kind of situation, which is they have the creative team, which love tools like Glaze and Nightshade, and they want it like yesterday. Then they have sort of the commercial team, which is business managers and directors and production people who basically want to use AI because it means lower costs, fewer employees, all the things, right? And then they've got lawyers who are like looking at this going, this is crazy because they're worried about them infringing things, but they're also simultaneously actively suing others for infringing their work. And so all of these have like different sort of tensions, if you will. And so, yeah, it's a mess at many of these companies internally because they can't agree. Like these three groups are actively at tension, at odds with each other. And so, yeah, I know that many of them, a number of them, have reached out and they want to explore using some of these tools, but the problem is that they can't do that while simultaneously running AI or simultaneously running AI in other people's content, because then they would literally be able to, it's a legal thing too, right? You can't do this and sue somebody else for doing this to you. It's very complicated. But yeah, I've had conversations. It's very complicated.
I think that will be all for our Q&A. Thank you for all the questions. And let's thank you for Professor Zhao for bringing us such a wonderful talk on AI.
Thanks. Hey, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I shut down the recording and